Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Medisodes. In this week's episode, we're going to be tackling one of the most important systems in the body, the one which is seen as the overall controller, which connects all the other systems. We're, of course, talking about the nervous system, and in today's episode, we're going to be breaking down its structure, how it works, how it's used, and how especially the brain, which is the overall controller, works. But let's start off with the actual structure of the nervous system. The nervous system is comprised of two main parts. The central nervous system, which is consisting of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which are all the sensory nerves, the motor nerves, and the relay connectors, making up the outer parts which take inputs from receptor cells and send inputs to effector cells. These inputs are known as nerve impulses. In the peripheral nervous system can actually be subdivided further into the autonomic and somatic nervous systems. The somatic nervous system controls all the voluntary motion that you do and mainly stimulates skeletal muscles. These are the muscles that you'll find in your legs, arms, and other parts of your body where you have to willingly and consciously move them. The autonomic nervous system, on the other hand, controls involuntary actions, and this mainly stimulates smooth muscle, like you find in the lining of the intestine, and cardiac muscle, like you find around your heart, as well as glands in the body. These are all processes that can happen unconsciously, and therefore don't need to be controlled by conscious thought. The autonomic nervous system can even be divided further into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, and these are used to control what we can call two states of the body. In the parasympathetic nervous system, this prepares the body for the rest and digest state, where the body is seeking to consume and process food and do other resting actions. The sympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, prepares the body for the flight or flight responses. This includes things such as speeding up heart rate, increasing sweating, emptying the bowels. It's the state of the body where it's more alert and active. Now we've discussed the divisions of the nervous system, let's talk about the most important cells that make up the nervous system, neurons. Now, an important note, while a neuron means just a single cell, often nerves are made up of several neurons, all connected together to create that transmission pathway for nerve impulses. The structure of a neuron itself is quite simple. There will be a cell body either located in the middle of the neuron or located at the dendron end in the case of motor neurons. And on either side will be the part of the neuron called the dendron and the part of the neuron called the axon. The important thing to note about how nerve impulses travel along neurons is that they will go from the dendron to the axon end of the neuron. At the dendron end, there are dendrites which help connect the neuron to either the receptors or effectors in the body, or other nerves themselves. Whereas at the axon end, there are terminal branches, which also form the similar connections. These are really important for making sure that nerve impulses can travel uninterrupted between neurons. Along the main parts of the axon and dendron, the neuron is also coated in Schwann cells, which are made up of fatty insulating layers called the myelin sheath. This insulates the nerve cell, speeding up the rate of transmission of signals and also making sure that charge isn't leaked when trying to transmit nerve impulses. But how are these nerve impulses actually generated? Well, to do that, we need to talk about their resting potentials. When no stimulus is applied to a neuron, the neuron will have a resting potential of around minus 70 millivolts in terms of potential difference. This is caused by channels and carrier proteins located in the surface cell membranes of the axons, which maintain a constant balance of sodium ions and potassium ions on the inside and outside of the cell. When no stimulus is being applied, this will be kept constant to make sure the cell stays at that minus 70 millivolt level. However, when the cell has a stimulus applied to it, this causes a series of events that can generate a nerve impulse. The first is depolarization. The opening of Na+ gates inside the cell surface membrane open some of the voltage-dependent sodium ion channels, causing a positive feedback effect where sodium ions rush into the axon. This depolarizes it, causing the level of potential difference to go from minus 70 millivolts all the way up to 40 millivolts. At this point, the action potential, or nerve impulse, has been generated, and this leads to repolarization, about 0.5 milliseconds after the depolarization. All the voltage-dependent Na+ channels spontaneously close, and instead voltage-dependent K+ or potassium ion channels open. These diffuse back out of the cell, causing the potential difference to plummet once again, and even leading to hyperpolarization, where it temporarily hits minus 80 millivolts. To restore the resting potential, the voltage-dependent potassium channels close, and sodium-potassium pumps start to function, restoring the levels inside and outside of the cell of ions back to normal. This process happens in a matter of milliseconds, and it creates a short burst of electrical energy through the neuron, which is the nerve impulse. This travels along the neuron with the same process of depolarization, repolarization, and hyperpolarization, and then the restoring the electric potential, happening in short segments along the entire neuron. This effectively allows for very fast travel of electrical signals along these neurons. Now, you might remember I mentioned the Schwann cells and the myelin sheath earlier. These are really important because between each Schwann cell, there is a gap where the axon is unmyelinated, called a node of Ranvier. Now, with a myelinated neuron, the only places where depolarization can occur are these nodes of Ranvier. And so you'll get a process which is known as saltatory conduction, where the electrical impulse jumps between these nodes and doesn't have to travel through all the myelinated sections of insulated neuron. This, again, further speeds up the transmission, and is why the nervous system is one of the fastest ways for the body to send impulses around the body and make sure it controls all different parts of it. But now we've talked about how nerves actually work, I'm going to pass over to Adrian, who's going to talk about reflexes.
Reflexes are quick responses to stimulus that help with survival. Generally, the reflex doesn't involve a conscious part of the brain, and is often quicker than any other conscious decision could be. Simple nervous pathways called reflex arcs are responsible for reflexes, rapid involuntary responses to certain stimuli. Firstly, receptors detect a stimulus and generate a nervous impulse. These receptors may be temperature receptors in the skin or pressure receptors in the hand. Then, sensory neurons conduct this action potential to the CNS along the nervous pathway. The CNS consists of the brain and spinal cord, as I've mentioned before, and depending on where the reflex occurs, the signal will be directed to this brain or the spinal cord. The sensory neuron enters the spinal cord through the dorsal root and forms a synapse with another type of neuron called the relay neuron. A synapse, as has been mentioned before, is a small gap across which an action potential can pass. The relay neuron then forms another synapse with a motor neuron, which leaves the spinal cord through the ventral root. This motor neuron carries the action potential to an effector, which produces the response. Often, an effector is a muscle, which contracts to cause movement, or a gland which secretes a hormone. So, I'm now going to focus on a specific reflex, this being the pupil reflex. The iris muscle in the eye dilates or constricts the pupils in order to maintain light input, whilst reducing eye damage from excessive light. The iris consists of two types of muscle that work together to change pupil size. To dilate the pupil, radial muscles contract and circular muscles relax. To constrict the pupil, radial muscles relax and circular muscles contract. In the pupil reflex, a change in light intensity levels of both eyes will lead to a change in pupil contractions of both eyes. So now I'm going to focus on a slightly different part of this topic, brain imaging. Currently we have several different methods that we use to view the brain, and all of them have their own merits and disadvantages. To start off with, positron emission tomography, or PET scans. A PET scan produces a 3D image of the brain. Firstly, the patient is administered with a radioactive tracer that acts in a similar fashion to glucose. Often this is fluoroglucose, which is radioactive, which is absorbed by the body cells to be used for respiration. brain is then scanned to identify where the tracer is present, and this gives information on body functions. This gives information on brain functioning by showing which area of the brain the tracer is present in. The tracer will be used up more in parts of the brain where respiration is higher, because aerobic respiration demands glucose, and more active parts of the brain require more energy release from ATP, and thus will be using more of this radioactive glucose. These areas are highlighted more on the PET scan, and thus we can see which parts of the brain are active and which parts of the brain are less active. This helps identify parts of brain damage, where you normally expect that part of the brain to be active, but it's not. Next is computerized tomography, or CT scans. CT scans produce a 2D image of the brain, rather than 3D, using X-rays. X-rays pass through the tissues and are attenuated by dense regions in the brain. These results can show the structure of the brain and identify denser tissues, such as tumours. Abnormal absorption of X-rays can be used to identify parts of the brain that have got unusual growth, or parts of the brain that are letting through too many X-rays can be used to find areas of brain degradation or brain damage. Finally, MRI scans, magnetic resonance imaging. MRI scans apply a strong magnetic field and use radio waves to produce a static image of the brain, giving image about brain structure. A type of MRI is functional MRI, and this can be used to look at the functionality of the brain, which is useful when testing for a person's ability to carry out certain tasks. fMRI scans show where oxygen activity in the brain is highest. This is because deoxyhemoglobin absorbs radio waves, unlike oxyhemoglobin, and deoxyhemoglobin is more present in areas where the brain is more active. For example, a person can be asked to perform a particular task, and an fMRI scan carried out straight after to identify the part of the brain that is used for that task. So now I'm going to hand over to Shrey, who's going to be talking more about the brain structure and how it relates to the nervous system.
So, the brain is arguably the most important organ within the body, and it's responsible as the coordinating center for all nervous activity. So, there are many different parts of the brain. So, let's start with the big outer part of the brain, the grey, highly folded bit that you see when you might have seen a brain, called cerebral cortex. And it's split into two hemispheres, and they're divided down the middle. So you have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And rather confusingly, the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. And it's composed mainly, the cerebral cortex, of nerve cell bodies, synapses, dendrites, which give it a grey colour. And these grey colours gives it its name grey matter. And the cortex is about 2/3 of the brain's total mass, and is therefore its largest region. And within the cortex, it's made up of 4 lobes: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobes, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. So let's look at what these lobes actually do. Starting with the frontal lobe, and this is responsible for higher brain functions, such as decision-making, reasoning, planning, forming associations, and ideas, and kind of all those complex things that make humans so successful as a species. It's also the location of the primary motor cortex, where neurons connect directly to the spinal cord and brainstem and then to muscles. And the primary motor cortex is responsible for sending nervous impulses to the muscles via motor neurons to make them contract and relax, and therefore control movement. Behind the frontal lobe is the parietal lobes, and they're responsible for orientation, movement, sensation, calculation, and memory. And as with all these lobes, if there's any damage to them, these functions can definitely be hindered and impaired. At the very back of the brain is the occipital lobe, and it's the site of the visual cortex, which is obviously involved in processing information from the eyes, from the optical nerve. So they interpret vision, color, shape, perspective, and it's a really complex and important part of the brain, which can be damaged. And for example, if you're ever struck on the back of the head, you might see stars, and that's because the occipital lobe is being overwhelmed, and that causes you to see stars. Towards the bottom of the brain is the temporal lobe, and it's involved in processing auditory information, so that's sounds from the ears. And it's involved in hearing, speech, specifically the left temporal lobe is involved in speech, and also some forms of memory. And again, it's a very important lobe in terms of sensory information, in terms of your hearing. And each lobe will interpret and manage its own sensory inputs and is sort of independent. Below the grey matter is the white matter. And this is basically a series of nerve axons that connect neurons to different parts of the brain. And it's almost like the junction for the whole brain from the body to the brain goes through this white matter, and then it gets sent to the grey matter. And it's white because of the myelin sheaths of the axon. So if we look at this, the cerebral hemispheres, these two cerebral hemispheres are connected by a the cerebral hemispheres are connected by a broad band of white matter, and this is known as the corpus callosum. And it's kind of towards the top of the brain, and it's really important in terms of being able to make sure the nerve impulses get to the correct parts of the brain. Below the corpus callosum are a number of important structures. For example, the thalamus, which is involved in routing sensory information to the correct part of the brain via axons in the white matter, which is the different lobes cannot do their job unless they're given the correct sensory information. Also, the hypothalamus, which is very important in homeostasis. For example, thermoregulatory control, and it's the site of many regulatory sensors, such as thermoregulatory, ventilation, etc. And also sleep, hunger, thirst, all these things are controlled by the hypothalamus. And it also acts as an endocrine gland, secreting hormones such as antidiuretic hormone, ADH, which controls the permeability of the collecting ducts in the kidneys. And it does this by connecting directly to the pituitary gland, which is right below the hypothalamus. And that allows it to act as an endocrine gland and secrete these hormones into the bloodstream. Next, we have the hippocampus, which is involved in long-term memory, which is obviously very important, and an important part of learning, being able to recall stuff from past experience. Finally, the basal ganglion is a collection of neurons deep within each hemisphere, and they're involved in selecting and initiating stored programs and movements. So that's kind of, again, learning from experience, knowing how do you run, how do you walk, the kind of things you learn, and they are pre-programmed, and that's what the basal ganglion can do. And at the very bottom of the brain is a structure known as the cerebellum, as well as the brainstem. So if we look at the brainstem, firstly, it's about evolutionary, the oldest part of the brain, and it's found at the top of the spinal column. And it connects the midbrain to the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata is responsible for regulating all the bodily processes that are not consciously controlled. Think heart rate, think breathing, think digestion. All those things are controlled by the medulla oblongata. And the midbrain is what relays information to the cerebral hemispheres. So it's the hypothalamus, thalamus, hippocampus, basal ganglion, corpus callosum. Those are all parts of the midbrain. And if we look at the cerebellum, that's also a very important structure because it allows you for coordination and balance, or using muscles, the motor cortex, and the joints working together to make sure that you stay upright and you're not going to fall over all the time. And it works with different parts of the brain to coordinate that, and also checks the motor programs that you're using are correct before it sends the impulses to muscles. So we quickly look at how the brain develops as well. It's in the embryonic stage that we find its origin, which is the neural tube. And in the embryo, it will then develop into the forebrain, which is the lobes, the midbrain, which is the different structures within the white matter, and then the hindbrain, which is the brainstem and the cerebellum. And we see that in many other species that complex species have similar brain structures to us, which might indicate that it's and it comes from evolutionary ancestor, that all these things are similar. So that's the brain. I hope you understand a bit more about what And now I'm going to hand back to Anupam.
And with that wrap up on the brain, thank you for watching today's episode. Hopefully you've learnt a lot more about the nervous system, how it works, and what it does for your body. As always, we upload videos every Friday, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and stick around for next week's video. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.